Hello, this recording is going to be on art from World War I to World War II. Anastasia is here to help me, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. So we're going to talk briefly about Die Stijl, and then we'll move to the Bauhaus, and then from there into Surrealism, so it should be pretty short. So Die Stijl is a Dutch movement. It's also called neoplasticism, and you're probably familiar with it. Mondrian, the artist that we're looking at here, is one of the most famous artists in this movement. And it develops during World War I, actually, in 1917 in the Netherlands. And so basically these artists are attempting to reach universal ideas in art by reducing art to its most essential means, so form and color. So they're proposing simplicity and order and functionality built on the most geometric forms possible, so lines, and the most basic colors, so the three primary tones plus black, gray, and white. And you can see here that we have the primary colors and only lines dividing them. We have irregularly shaped squares, and then we have some white, black, and gray. So this is completely abstract, and it resists, this movement itself resists recognizable imagery because they see any type of imagery as conveying a meaning that's based on the culture that produces it. So it's not universal. So the idea behind this abstract art is that anyone would be able to relate to it. They wouldn't need to have a cultural understanding in order to know. So for instance, in keeping with World War II coming up, the symbol for the Nazis, the swastika, has a very specific meaning in the West, right? So it signifies racism, white supremacy, and genocide, whereas that symbol has been used for centuries in other cultures by Native Americans, by people in India, and it carries a very different meaning. So you can see how something that seems as basic as a swastika actually can mean very different things across cultures. And it has positive connotations in these cultures. India and some indigenous cultures. So what the artists of the Die Stijl or neoplastic movement are attempting to get away from is this sense of a meaning that is inherent in the shape, even if it is more abstracted. And because this is such a simplistic style, it's very formally adept, but in terms of lines and colors, it's actually able to move very easily from painting into design and architecture. And the term neoplasticism is coined by Mondrian himself. And so this is freeing art from the obligation of naturalistic representation. And again, its intent is to express universal harmony by avoiding individualism and particularity. So you can see how universal harmony in the middle of World War I would be a very appealing idea. And so it aims to find laws of equilibrium and harmony that are applicable to life and society, not just art. And they see that this abstraction is particularly clear. There's no figurative aspects to confuse anyone. So the term Die Stijl means the style. And it's seen by members not just as, say, surface ornament, but it's essentially a structure that functions as a sign for an ethical view of society. And so the configuration of elements here symbolize the relationship between the individual and the collective. And none of these elements could stand on their own. They all need each other. And you can see how it extends beyond the picture plane. So here you can see the frame made by the creator that continues the lines of this painting. okay? And we're going to see it in architecture as well. Here it is in design, so you can see how we have these very simple lines, but we also have these little squares, which are visible in some of the other works. I might have some in the other direction. The basic colors, the simplicity, the stark and austere nature. So this is a Gerrit Rietveld chair. This is red-blue chair, and it's made in 1918. And again, this is an example of the Stijl style. In architecture, it uses modern materials to achieve smooth surfaces with austere lines that allow it to have a relationship with the surrounding environment. So you can see how the use of, I believe this is stucco, is used to make a very clean exterior, very clean lines. Again, very austere. You can see the very straight lines of the windows as well as the roof line. And this extends into more decorative elements. So this is the Schroeder House by Gerrit Rietveld from 1924, and this is in Utrecht in the Netherlands. This is a proposal for a hall. So this is not the actual hall, but simply the proposal by Theo van Doesburg. And again, you can see how it's these same colors repeated over and over in an attempt to find a universal language, a universal harmony that speaks to everyone. So you can see how it applies to interior design, architecture, painting. This is another Mondrian from 1936 called Composition C. And his work is intended to convey absolute reality. So he is seeing the world as being pure geometric forms that underlie all of existence. And in 1920, he publishes a manifesto for this style. And he develops this severely geometric style between 1915 and 1920. He actually started out much more figurative. You can see this painting Gray Tree from 1912 by Mondrian is very recognizable as a tree, although abstracted. And again, you can see the tree progressing, right? Cubist elements, very cubist. And then it becomes these very busy forms that eventually Mondrian will reduce to the simplest elements, lines, and the simplest colors, black, white, gray, and the three primary colors. Okay. All right, so the Bauhaus is next. And this is a school that brings fine arts and applied arts under one roof, and it integrates them completely into a single curriculum. And it builds upon the influences of Expressionism as well as Neoplasticism, so the works of Mondrian that we just saw. And it's founded in 1919 by the architect Gropius. And it's dismantled by the Nazis in 1933. So this is in the Weimar Republic. And what we're looking at here is one of the homage to the squares painted by Joseph Albers. So the Bauhaus is, it encompasses lots of different disciplines. And it is not just for creating fine art, right? It is intended to privilege functionality and to allow function and form to be united. So the concept of workshop training rather than academic studio education was underlying this. And it's this communal idealism that reacts against World War I. So prior to World War I, the founder of this school, Gropius, and you can see here this chair that he made in 1920. So you can see the severely geometric lines like we were talking about with neoplasticism, but still the functionality as well as the aesthetic appearance. So prior to World War I, Gropius advocates for the cooperation between art, industry, and commerce. But after World War I, he reverts to the idea of the medieval craftsman, because it caused him, World War I caused him to have grave doubts about the machine and expectations of progress associated with it. right? So if you think back to the discussion of the New Order, works like Picasso's neoclassical style, you have artists who are moving away from this idea of technology and the avant-garde being what will save us. And so Gropius kind of pulls back, and he hopes that by turning towards the Middle Ages and the idea of lodges and guilds from the Middle Ages will allow the Bauhaus students and faculty to tap into that deep spirituality and communal ideals and meaning and direction. To the extent that in the early days, you did not have professors and students, but rather masters and apprentices. And you have huge names in the art world who participated in the Bauhaus, who taught there. So many of the faculty are devoted to the ideal of purity of geometric forms, which is seen as an appropriate expression of the modernist canon. And you're going to have artists here who are pushing the edges of the type of art that is created, but you're not going to see aggressively political works like we saw with Dada. There's none of that here. So a modern day example, it's not a perfect correlation, but if you think of IKEA, which has functional but streamlined, well, artfully designed objects designed for public consumption at a reasonable price. And that's essentially what the Bauhaus was striving to create. And when it started, it originally had an expressionist aesthetic. So think about the expressionism that we've seen in this class before. But this is gradually replaced by functionalism and an interest in industrial design. And this is seen here, in the graphic design here, right? So movable type. And there is this interest in paring things down to very universal forms, really taking away any excess ornamentation. So this is coming right around 1920, in the 1920s to early 30s. And if you think of Victorian times, so let me kind of show you what Victorian artwork was. And Victorian artwork is around 1900, a bit before, a bit after. But you can see why something like this would be very relevant. So if we look for Victorian, okay, we're going to see very ornate, right? The women wear these very elaborate costumes that completely cover them up. You have very intricate work. So this is Renaissance revival, right? So it's going back to the Renaissance, and you can see how intricate it is. And Victorian is not the reigning style at the time of the Bauhaus, but hopefully you can kind of get a feel for some of the aesthetic of the Victorian time period. And then there is the Art Nouveau. Sorry, I had to think how to spell Nouveau, which arises around 1900 and it lasts till 1915-ish. And this is very focused on organic forms. So you have furniture like this hall stand, which is based on the idea of things like vines and nature. And when I say organic, I mean something that is grown rather than produced, right? And so you have all these curving organic lines. Even this picture, right? This picture is designed to have flowers. It's intricate. It's very graceful. But the Bauhaus is very different from this. So look at the difference here. This is from 1929 to 30. It's a coffee pot by Christian Dell. And this is a picture, right? Look at how austere the lines are, how simple, how sleek. And this is something that would be affordable for the masses. So something like this would not necessarily be as affordable because it takes a lot of craftsmanship to be able to make it work along these lines, right? The silver, whereas something like this is made in more accessible materials, so less expensive. These things are easier to mass produce. So this is an example of form and function combined. Although Gropius saw the Bauhaus as a way of moving away from technology and the advancements that were expected of technology and going back more towards the medieval guild, you have other artists such as Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who is pushing functionalism, right? So this idea of function over form, and he is not troubled by the relationship with machines and industry. He sees technology as the reality of the 20th century, and he uses a lot of science and scientific content in his teaching. So again, right, you can see this is an inkwell. So before you have pens that you can just click, you would have to dip in your pen and ink and write. And so this is where you would store ink, but you can see that it's a very austere, simple, and yet very visually pleasing design. And this is a work by Annie Albers, who is the wife of Joseph Albers, who we saw the homage to the square. And she worked with textiles. So you have artists such as Paul Klee, Kandinsky. These are artists who are teaching at the Bauhaus, but then you also have a focus on things like jewelry, and there's some performance art, there are textiles, there's industrial design, as we just saw. Okay, so these are tapestries made by Annie Albers. And so again, you can see how something that is, Anastasia is trying to get the flower on my sweater, I'm sorry. You can see how it uses some of the vocabulary, the formal vocabulary of modernism to create these straight lines in an object that is still functional. Okay, so let's see here. We have Hans Meyer, who's the director from 1928 to 30, and he moves it to be a center of production rather than a unified art school. So I'm just going to show you some works that have come out of the Bauhaus. Some jewelry here. This is later, but it is by Annie Albers, as well as Alexander Reed. And we were just looking at Annie Albers. And so this is kind of the aesthetic of the Bauhaus, something beautiful yet functional. So you can see how this would be probably like a drain stopper and paper clips, and then just the beaded necklace, right? So Hans Meyer is the director from 1928 to 30. And he promotes rigorous functionalism in architecture, and he believes that buildings should be designed according to economic, technical, social, and psychological factors. But he is eventually dismissed from his post because of his Marxist leanings in 1930. And then in 1930 to 1933, you have the architect Mies van der Rohe becomes the director, and he's another adherent of functionalism, right? So this idea of the function of the piece being utterly important, okay? Again, you can just see how there's a variety of objects. This is an example of the performance pieces that were put on. These costumes were designed by members of the Bauhaus. Furniture, right? Again, these very clean, simple lines. But here we have a painting called The Twittering Machine by Paul Klee, and this is a very famous work. And you can see that this is decorative. It does not have a functional intent. So it's not solely function with form added to it, but there are also aesthetic creations such as this. And then this is the architecture that is really advocated by the Bauhaus. So Mies van der Rohe is anxious to bring the school back to a non-political course, and he combines the demand for social efficiency with high aesthetic standards. He transfers from the Weimar Republic to Berlin. He transfers the school in 1932, and it is shut down in 1933 by the Nazis, who classify it as Bolshevist. So you can see that we are seeing here this unity between design and art and craft. So this is the Bauhaus workshop, and it's extremely famous. You can see how clean and austere it is, but it's still utilizing relatively recent innovations, such as how to be able to build glass walls like this. And it's based on the idea of basic geometric shapes, such as the cube, the rectangle, the circle, and there's a belief in the truth of materials. So you don't want to disguise what the material is. It's very clear what these are, right? So this looks like, I would say, concrete or stucco, and that's because that is what it is. In fact, you can see that none of these elements are trying to be something they're not. So think about the Baroque ceiling paintings that we've seen with the sculptures and the painted sculptures, all of that trying to be something that it's not. And so this is really the opposite of that. And here you can see in Dessau, the Bauhaus aerial view. So the Bauhaus did move a lot, but it eventually becomes the laboratory of prototypes for industrial mass production. And it comes up with a dynamic new method of expression that's easily reproduced and disseminated in terms of graphics. And the overall goal is simple, modern, yet aesthetically pleasing design. Okay. Oh dear. Anastasia is on the real keyboard, not the decoy keyboard. Okay. So then the last thing that I want to talk about tonight is Surrealism. And Surrealism has its roots in the Dada movement. So if you'll remember, here's Hugo Ball reciting the sound poem Karawan. And as I mentioned, right, these are words that are intended to be spoken. They do not mean anything, but they're intended to mimic the sound of African dialects. Hannah Hock, who is taking images from other sources and combining them in new ways to create a piece with a different meaning, right? So even though the Dada artists emphasized absurdity and they sought to fight against logic, etc., there's still meaning here, right? So BMW, it's a comment on commercialism, the objectification of the female body, new technology, all of this. Excuse me. So we are going to move, just again, to kind of show you some collages. And these were made by Hans Arp, who would cut shapes out of paper and then just drop them onto another piece of paper. And then he would kind of tweak it, but essentially he kind of allowed the random aspect to stand. The element of absurdity. So this is LHOOQ by Duchamp. And here he has drawn a little mustache and goatee on the Mona Lisa. Okay, and this is called Cadeau. This is by Man Ray. And this is an iron. So I know it doesn't look like irons that we think of now, but basically you would put this on a stove. You would get the flat surface here heated, and then you would use it to press your clothing. So by gluing tacks to the center of this iron, it's completely non-functional, right? It's an absurdity. And then finally, Fountain by Duchamp, and signed Armut, right? So all of these things. And these all help lead to Surrealism. And Surrealism is one of the, these are some precursors to Surrealism. But here's a great piece. So this is by Merritt Oppenheim, and this is called Object. And Surrealism is one of the last major avant-garde movements between the wars. And so it seeks to render a higher reality by unleashing the unconscious or the analysis of dreams. And the Surrealists are very into Freudian theory. So if you know anything about psychology, you know that Freud believed in dreams and dreams having meanings and the subconscious. And he also was hyper fixated on sexuality and how that is expressed. And so we see that all of those elements come through in Surrealist work. The Surrealists reject the ideas of order and beauty that are found in works like Picasso's neoclassical period, right? This return to order. Surrealism is founded in 1924 in Paris, but it really has its roots in the late 1910s, Dada, etc. And Surrealism flourishes especially in the 1920s and 30s, although it does live longer than that. And like Dada, the Surrealists believe that dogged adherence to the rational has led humanity on an unending pursuit of progress, but rather than being very pessimistic and depressed in the way that the Dada artists and artworks were, this is a much more positive movement. And it was actually originally literary. And it focuses on the irrational, chance, uncanny, and unconscious. So Freud had proclaimed the unconscious mind the seat of artistic creativity. And this is something that really resonates with the Surrealists. So I'm going to come back to Object because this is incredibly famous. It's exactly what it looks like. It is a teacup on a saucer with a spoon that's completely covered in fur. This is completely unusable, but it is aesthetically pleasing, and it does have a tactile sensation to it. You want to reach out and pet it, and conveniently, I am able to pet a cat while I'm looking at this, so it works out well for me. But it's unusable, and there are also there's also symbolism to fur related to sexuality, etc. So it has all of these various elements going through it. And we have a couple of distinct strands of aesthetics in Surrealism. So this is an assemblage by the artist Joseph Cornell, and you can see that he has taken seemingly random elements, but then he combines them in ways that are very aesthetically appealing and that seem to have a deeper meaning. So one of the strands is automatism. Let me see, here we go. Yes, so this is, oops, sorry, not this. Let me see. No, this is the other strand. Bear with me. So you have automatism, which is automatic drawing or painting. I have frozen Luna, so apologies. And then you also have this other strand, which is this hallucinatory sense of super reality. So scenes that make no sense. So work by Magritte, whose work we're seeing here, and Dali. And these are extremely well executed. Technically and formally, these are executed to the same level as, say, the academic paintings of the 19th century. These are dream settings. And Magritte is famous for creating these works that are fantastical, yet they look like they could be happening. This is the Son of Man, extremely famous. So we see an image of a man, but his face is obscured by an apple, which seems to be growing out of his hat. You have here an artist painting this figure who is three-dimensional, but does not exist where he has not yet applied the paint. And one aspect of the Surrealists that crops up in many of the artworks is this emphasis on sexuality and violence. And it is very disturbing. So Dali, right? So we're used to these images, these landscapes that it looks like it could be a real landscape, but the elements make no sense. And so this is intended to look like a dream, like a nightmare potentially. So this is the temptation of Saint Anthony. And Saint Anthony was in the desert and he was praying, and the devil sought to tempt him with very beautiful women, etc., and he was able to reject it. So the temptation of Saint Anthony is usually demons tormenting him. And here we see this nightmare-esque image of these horses and elephants with extremely long stilt-like legs, and these women and castles in the sky. So one thing that some of the artists would do is they would fall asleep sitting in a chair, and they would hold something metal, like I have here a spoon. And they would drape their hand down over the side of the chair. And while they were sleeping, their hand would slowly loosen and they would drop the spoon. And they would have something underneath the spoon so that it would clatter and it would wake them up. And then they would start drawing what their dreams had been, because there really is this emphasis on the unconscious, subconscious mind. This is actually called Remorse, or Sphinx Embedded in the Sand, and it is at Michigan State University. It's a really great piece if you ever get the chance to see it. Lots of symbolism, the persistence of memory, right? So you have this seemingly realistic landscape with these really shrill colors. You have these fantastical nightmarish elements, such as the ants here, the clocks melting. This is a face. Here you see the nose and the eye with the eyelashes extending. And here you can see these ants coming out or going into this pocket watch, right? So it's not intended to be something that you can look at and immediately decipher. It's intended to be somewhat alarming and disturbing and very dreamlike, unsettling. So this is a great example of Magritte's work. And so what we're looking at here, so switching from Dali back to Magritte, this is called The Human Condition from 1933. And what we see is an easel represented here with a painting on canvas that's seen here. And it is placed against, apologies, cat keyboard not working well. It is placed against a window, and you can see that it continues, or seems to continue, the scene that is outside of the window. But the thing is, even though it looks like this is a seamless continuation of this path, of the grass, of the shrubs, it's a painting. You have no way of knowing what is behind the painting of the painting. Right? You don't know what is outside of this window in the landscape. So painting is not representation of reality. And so this is an attempt to kind of try to make people think about it. And this is borne out by the the treachery of images, or This Is Not a Pipe. It's also called The Treason of Images. And what you see is a painting of a pipe. So one that you would, light and then smoke your tobacco. And down here in French, it says, Ceci n'est pas une pipe, which says, this is not a pipe. So this is meant to be taken literally. This is not a pipe. You cannot smoke it. You cannot cut it out and use it as a pipe. It is simply a two-dimensional depiction of a pipe, hence the treachery or treason of images. So it's an idea that painting is not the truth, right? So we'll keep going. And then the other strand, of Surrealism is automatism, which is what I was talking about. So automatic drawing or painting, and this occurs when the artist is attempting to remove the conscious mind from creation. So doodling, etc. And this is a direct response to Freud as well. And it's seeking to suppress the conscious mind and allow the subconscious to take over. So this is a Max Ernst piece. And I believe that this piece is created by a process of decalcomania. So you have a painted surface and then you press a sheet of paper onto it and then peel it off again. And you get these interesting textures and this very biomorphic organic forms that are not intentionally created, but created as part of this. And so you would create this sort of work by doing the process that I just explained. And then the artist would come through and add elements, enhance other elements to make it seem like a landscape painting. This is called Europe After the Rain. So you can see how this could be interpreted as the devastation of war. Okay, it looks like a landscape. Here's another example of this type of work. You also have something called grattage, which is scraping pigment on a canvas that's on top of a textured surface. So you see things like wood grain come through in some of these works. And this is a good example. You can see the grain of something beneath this work. And it creates these very textured landscapes almost for these works. Another way of implementing chance would be to have a glue-covered canvas, you pour sand on it and then doodle, and then use that to bring out the forms that are there. But the most popular type of surrealism, the one that we're most familiar with, is this hallucinatory super reality sense. And this is, again, images demonstrating the unconscious desires of the artists that are then communicated to the spectators. So this is by Dorothea Tanning. This is called Birthday. She is one of the more famous female surrealist artists. Okay, this is another one of her works that's very famous, very nightmare, yet has a whimsical element even. So let's see here. I want to show you just a couple of other types of works. So there are also these, which are, again, very organic forms. This is by the artist Miro. This is called Personages with Star, and it's from 1933. And you can see how these are very much the doodles that I was talking about, the automatism, and then enhancing them so that they seem like there's possibly a narrative here, but very abstracted. You can see, right, like the stick figure, the stars, and those are quite famous. And then getting back to the hyper reality, super reality, you can see these landscapes which look like they are underwater. And this is Yves Tanguay. And you can see that these are very fantastical and non-realistic, yet very appealing. And they look like there's a story behind them, although it's not exactly clear what that story is. So the last thing that I want to mention is, and if this interests you, I would highly recommend that you check out the exhibit in 1933, I believe, the Exposition Internationale du Surrealism. 1938, January. And these artists created, they dressed up mannequins and they presented it. And going into this exhibit, it is very dimly lit and you were given a flashlight and you had to navigate down this very narrow hallway that is lined by these mannequins who have been dressed up in various ways by the artists. And here is an example. Oh my word. So sorry. Anastasia, this is not gonna work. Come on, baby. Oh. You're fine. So sorry. Okay, so if we go back, this is one of the mannequins by André Masson. And this is what the viewer or the visitor would have to squeeze through using a flashlight. Very eerie. Again, there's a lot of violence towards women, which is expressed and is quite disturbing, but it is an interesting art period. So the last thing is photography within Surrealism. And again, it's this idea of dream and reality. So this is noir et blanche. So noir is black and blanche is white. So black and white. And you see, again, this focus on African objects, African forms, compared to the face of the model, right? And so you are having these artists using new techniques, but they're also using juxtaposition of objects. So here you can see that it has been jiggled so that it creates this very unsettling image of multiple eyes on the same woman. They decontextualize these images. And there's a strong element of surprise in the movement, which is often achieved by unexpected juxtapositions. And it seeks to fuse the conventional logical view of reality with the unconscious and the dream experience in order to achieve super reality. And you can see this is a self-portrait by Herbert Bayer, and it's taken in 1932, and he has manipulated the photograph so that it looks like he has accidentally removed part of his arm, etc. So I'm going to wrap it up here, and I will see you soon. Okay, bye.